Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eddie Jennings, and in today's video, the title, as you've probably seen, is Skipping IT Deployment Planning a Bad Idea? Thanks, Captain Obvious. Well, there are times where, even though something seems so obvious that, yes, we always need to do good planning for your IT deployment, it gets overlooked, or an emergency happens and just things go awry. And I'm not going to do a video telling you why it's important to plan your IT deployments of anything, whether it's infrastructure, applications, on and on and on. What I am going to do is give you a scenario of where this good planning didn't happen and what happened because of it. Because really what's lost when you don't do proper planning is time. And sometimes there are folks that, in my opinion, short-sightedly say, hey, we're just going to wing it and go and save a little bit of time that would be spent on planning, but almost always that time will be spent later either troubleshooting something that could have been planned against or dealing with some situation that would be much easier to mitigate had you had a plan and deviate from that plan and kind of have a direction on where to deviate to deal with the problem. But the scenario I present to you can completely happen in the real world, and pieces of the scenario I've dealt with myself, and it can be frustrating, but learning can happen from it. And so in our scenario, we're going to assume a couple of things. You have you in the story, and you're a part of a particular team primarily dealing with infrastructure. As far as in your company, you get VMs spun up, you configure servers, deal with account management, not account management as far as like sales, but user account management, permissions, and all that kind of stuff. You have folks that primarily run databases, you have folks that primarily run network devices, and then you have folks that primarily support the applications that run on the infrastructure that you build, that has databases handled by that database team that talks to one another using a network that is controlled by the network team. And so you have your application, and this thing is so important that you've brought in the vendor to help with the deployment. They have professional services that you're like, hey, we know a good bit about the application, but this is a pretty big deal. Let's bring in some outside help to make sure stuff goes right. Well, in the ideal world, what you'll have is you'll have your meetings and such where you talk about infrastructure. Okay, to plan this app, to deploy this application, we're going to need X servers and Y databases, and Z things need to be open on the network, all that kind of thing. And you'll think through user acceptance testing and all that good stuff. But in this situation, you get the call of, all right, we're deploying it today, and none of that is in place. Well, so this puts everyone into a scramble. You, on the infrastructure team, you start trying to crank out VMs, which thankfully you're in a virtualized environment, so this process is relatively quick, but it still takes some time to do, and you're creating necessary user accounts in your directory services. You're granting those accounts whatever access that they need for these servers that you're cranking out, and then the database folks are getting involved with doing, since there apparently wasn't much planning going on. This was all right, today we're deploying it. They're creating some database stuff, but really kind of doing just generic, hey, for most applications they need these things. This application happens to not have a whole lot of stuff needed from the network side because it's primarily an internal application, and internal communication is pretty standard on your network. And then your applications team, they really can't do anything because the infrastructure is not in place yet. So time is lost. It takes a couple of hours or so to get all the infrastructure going. All right, so at this point, hey, we have the infrastructure, let's start doing the application. Well, during the application install, you run into some permissions issues and such, which generally isn't a problem, again, if stuff's planned out, but you're having to do this in a rush, and you don't have all of the requirements in front of you. So while this application install is happening, you have to take a couple of steps back, reconfigure permissions here and there for users. You get that solved. Application is going, and at this point, you've had a few hours of this deployment happening. You get to the end of your workday. Some folks start to go home. You don't, because you're one of the main points on this application deployment as far as infrastructure. And eventually you get to where there's some issue with the databases. Now recall, databases aren't your thing. You're a part of infrastructure, and we have a team for databases and a team for network, and then the actual application support folk, right? And so now you have, all right, so we have to deal with the database, and that's not something you do. Luckily, you're in a situation where each of the departments has an on-call person. It's something that's traded periodically. And in my experience, both being a receiver of the on-call calls as well as being the sender of an on-call call, you try to avoid that if you can. It's just like major enterprise outage, we got to get the on-call person because stuff has to get up. Well, this particular application isn't something that, oh my God, the business is done, but we've paid the money to get that vendor to provide some assistance and support for deployment. And so you have money on the line here with that, because that right now, and until this database thing gets solved, no one's able to do anything. So you have to call the on-call for the database person, and then interrupt their whatever it is they're doing, during the off hours while they have the on-call phone or whatever method you have for that. And so they eventually get into the fold. They get the database problem solved. Application deployment finishes. Life's good. There are other steps that need to happen. So this application is deployed. We need to migrate some data and do some other things. But at this point, it is so late that the vendor needs to go and needs to reschedule. And so the moral of the story is, these things that you and other folks and other teams are having to do in a rush end up eating a lot of time that could be better spent with that vendor doing application specific deployment tasks and such, and getting questions answered. And for example, for these couple of things that came up that I described in the scenario, you have time for some guidance. You can fix it when the people are in staff in the office, and it can get done relatively quickly, and you have time to kind of do a little post-mortem and say, all right, so why did this happen? What are the things to look for? Plus, there are two other tasks that we didn't get to. It said data migration for the application, and a couple other things that, had the planning been there from the beginning, it would have went on. Now, when you have situation like that, and you will, if you're in IT and you've been in the IT field for a while, you'll have stuff that happens like this. It gets dumped on your plate. Hey, we're deploying now, go. And there should have been, here are the requirements and time spent making all that kind of stuff, but it just doesn't, and it happens. So what you take from it are, in my opinion, two things. Thing number one is whatever the breakdown of communication was between either the vendor that I mentioned that is doing the deployment, or whoever is managing the project kind of stuff. You need to let them know, hey, this happened, we got through it, but a lot of time was wasted. How can we prevent miscommunication to where we're aware of stuff that needs to be deployed, we're aware of what infrastructure we need, what database stuff we need, what network stuff we need, all that kind of stuff. Thing number two is, if this what was not necessarily an issue of planning hadn't happened, but it was an actual emergency where you often don't get to have planning, are there standard operating procedures that we could do with normal deployments that we kind of do for all deployments, and then tweak as needed for whatever is special about it, that could have been done in this situation, that whereas it is emergency throwdown, hey, we got to get it done, but you have some standard procedures in place for emergencies like that that can mitigate some of the time loss and of people waiting. Very difficult to do item two, and sometimes it's not even an option. There's obviously no way to plan for every emergency. So the moral of the scenario is, don't neglect planning, especially if you actually have the time and opportunity to do it. And that kind of gets to the Captain Obvious part of, hey, you're in IT, you need to plan before big deployments. But I think sometimes it's not good to have to experience it, but it is good when you have that temptation of, oh, we'll wing it, or we don't have the assurance that communication is going to happen for proper planning. It's kind of good to reflect on situations where you have dealt with poor planning, and you're like, hey, it's tempting to skip this, but we really need to spend the time, because if we don't, insert time wasting here can happen. So hopefully you found this a bit entertaining and not necessarily informative, because it's kind of obvious you need to be planning, but perhaps it gives a scenario that you can share with management if needed, if they're wanting to kind of like skimp on the plan and say, hey, this kind of thing can happen, and here's an example of it. Oh, hopefully it'll be useful in that respect. Always welcome comments and feedbacks. Have you had situations where it's just kind of dumped on, all right, we're deploying now, go. How are you able to do the scramble and get infrastructure and such going? How did you deal with the post-mortem? Were you able to make changes to prevent that happening again? Always welcome feedback, because through feedback and comments is how we learn from one another. So as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you the next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe to, or like the video and subscribe to the channel, so you can be aware of new content as it comes out. See you the next time.